Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This is lesson 12 in our VFR or private pilot level training series. In this video we'll take a look at how to operate your aircraft when there's a crosswind, including crosswind taxi technique, crosswind takeoff technique, and crosswind landings. We'll also talk about how to fly a low pass over the runway to give you a maneuver to use in practicing rudder and aileron control in crosswind conditions. I'll mention before we get started that in order to use appropriate crosswind technique in most airplanes, you need to have something assigned to control the rudder axis on your aircraft, preferably something on a controller or joystick rather than on a keyboard or mouse. There are several joysticks out there that feature a twist axis on the stick for yaw control, and if you don't mind spending some money, there are dedicated rudder pedals available for flight simulators. If I'm being completely honest, though, I wouldn't go out and buy something fancy just to be able to do crosswind landings. On most controls that have yaw axis control, the range of movement is pretty small, and almost all of them are spring-loaded to neutral, meaning they'll come back to the middle if you're not applying force to them. This makes for less than precise control and less than stellar crosswind technique, but unless you want to go spend big bucks on really nice rudder pedals, anything with some form of yaw control will get the job done. So what is a crosswind? A crosswind, as the name implies, and as you probably figured out, is a condition where the wind direction is not directly down the runway, but blowing at an angle to it instead. This makes it a little more difficult to control the aircraft during takeoff and landing. During landing, you have to use a specific technique to keep the airplane from drifting due to wind, but you also have to keep the nose pointed straight down the runway. You also need to use a specific technique when taking off in a crosswind, and in the real world, you should also adjust your controls for crosswind during your taxi in a light aircraft. The wind doesn't have to be blowing directly across the runway for you to have some crosswind. Anytime you have a wind that's not blowing directly down the runway, you'll have some crosswind component as well as some headwind component. You can use a flight computer app to determine how much crosswind component and how much headwind component you have on a given runway with a given wind. So headwind component and crosswind component are very easy to figure out if the wind is blowing directly down the runway or if it's blowing directly across the runway. For example, in Pine Bluff on runway 18, we know that the runway heading is 180. So let's assume that we have a wind that is 180 on the direction and 10 knots on the speed. So it's blowing directly out of the south or directly down the runway. In that case, we know that we have a headwind component of 10 knots and that the crosswind component is 0. So it's all headwind and no crosswind. And if we have the same runway, so runway heading of 180, and the wind is blowing 270 at 10 knots, in other words, it's blowing directly out of the west or directly across the runway, we know that we have a headwind component of 0 knots and a crosswind component of 10 knots. In other words, we have no headwind and all crosswind. But anywhere in between, we have to use either a flight computer or kind of a quick reference method to calculate how much crosswind component and headwind component we have. There are a couple of different types of crosswind calculators, and you can find the crosswind calculators or flight computer apps on any app store or program where you get apps for tablets or phones. And there are also plenty of websites out there if you search websites for either flight computers or crosswind calculators. There are plenty of sites out there that do that as well. So the two different types that you'll see are one where you enter the actual runway designation and then the wind speed and the wind direction, and then you just hit calculate and it tells you your crosswind and headwind component. And then you also have one where you enter the actual aircraft's heading and then the wind heading or wind direction and then the wind velocity. And then it'll give you your crosswind and headwind component there. The one on the left makes an assumption that, if you're on, say, runway 18, that the heading is 180, whereas the one on the right is going to be a little more precise. If you're on runway 18 and the runway heading is actually 184, you can actually enter that and it will be a little more precise. That being said, the one on the left is going to get you probably within a knot or so of the one on the right. They're both going to be pretty close. So we'll take a look at a calculation using the second calculator since it's just a little more precise. All you do is enter the data and then hit enter and it will give you the results. So let's assume that we are flying out of Pine Bluff. So that means our runway heading is 180. So we'll put that in aircraft heading. And let's assume that we have a wind that is 210 degrees at 20 knots. So out of the south-southwest at about 20 knots. And when we hit enter, it will tell us that we have a crosswind of just under 10 knots with that wind, crosswind component, and a headwind of just a little over 17 knots. You can see down here in the little comments, it tells you if you get a negative number, that means the crosswind is from the right. So this means we have a just under 10 knot right crosswind component. And then if we had a negative number down here, it would mean a tailwind, but this is positive, so we know it is a headwind. Now let's take a look at what would happen if the wind were to shift off to the right a little more. So we're still in Pine Bluff, still on runway 18. Runway heading is 180. Now the wind heading is 240. So it's shifted a little bit off to the right or a little bit off to the west, a little more of a crosswind. And the wind velocity stayed at 20 knots. We can see now that the crosswind is going to be 17.5 knots or 17.3 from the right, and the headwind component is now 10 knots. There's also a quick reference method that you can use to estimate how much crosswind component you're getting based on how far the wind direction is off of your runway heading. And if you have a wind that the direction is less than 15 degrees, between 0 and 15 degrees off the runway heading, that means you're not going to get any significant crosswind. If the wind direction is 15 to 30 degrees off your runway heading, you can guesstimate that you're going to get about 25% or about quarter of the total wind velocity as a crosswind component. If it's between 30 and 45 degrees off the runway heading, that means you're going to get about 50% of the total wind velocity as a crosswind component. If it's between 45 and 60 degrees off the runway heading, that means you're going to get about 75% or about 3/4 of the total wind velocity as your crosswind component. And if the wind is more than 60 degrees off the runway heading, that means that you are pretty much going to get all of that as a crosswind component. So let's run a quick calculation using that method compared with the flight computer method. So let's assume we're still at Pine Bluff, so our runway heading is still 180. Let's use that bigger crosswind. So we'll take our wind direction of 240 degrees with a wind velocity of 20 knots. We know that 240 is 60 degrees off the runway heading. And so we know from our quick reference little chart there that that was about 75% of the total wind velocity we're going to get as a crosswind component. So if we take 0.75 and multiply it times 20, we come up with about 15 knots. When we did this with a flight computer, we got about 17.3 knots. So it does tend to underestimate just a little bit, and it is not quite as accurate, but it will give you in the ballpark within a couple of knots. If you're really, really close on your max demonstrated crosswind component, then you'll probably want to drag out the flight computer and see how close you are, at least in the real world. But this will give you a ballpark as to whether or not that's going to be a factor. Speaking of maximum demonstrated crosswind component, most aircraft have a maximum demonstrated crosswind component. This is not technically a limitation. It's the maximum crosswind that was demonstrated by the test pilot during aircraft certification testing for that aircraft. But most pilots do treat it as a limit. Beyond this value, the aircraft may not have enough rudder authority to maintain the runway center line during a crosswind landing. In the Cessna 152, the maximum demonstrated crosswind component is 12 knots, but like many things in Flight Simulator, this value is not modeled exactly. And actually going out and flying the 152 in crosswinds in Flight Simulator, I found that it seems to have enough rudder authority to handle a little over 20 knots of crosswind, but I would not try that in a 152 in the real world. As a general rule, heavier aircraft are generally going to have a higher maximum demonstrated crosswind component than lighter aircraft, and low-wing aircraft are generally going to have a higher max demonstrated crosswind component than high-wing aircraft. To look at a couple of examples, the Cessna 172, which is high-wing but slightly heavier than the 152, has a max demonstrated crosswind component of 15 knots. The Diamond DA-40, which is a little heavier and a low-wing aircraft compared to the 152, has a max demonstrated crosswind component of 25 knots. And then the Airbus 320neo, which is lower wing than any of the Cessna models and obviously quite a bit heavier, has a max demonstrated crosswind component of 38 knots. In the real world, you need to consider not only the crosswind component, but the total wind velocity if you're flying a light aircraft. If the winds are extremely strong, you may want to consider postponing or canceling your flight. If the wind speed is within 10 or 15 knots of your VSO or the stall speed in the landing configuration, the wing or stabilizer may develop lift and cause difficulty with controlling the aircraft during taxi. In the real world, you also want to adjust your controls during taxi for the wind conditions, particularly in periods of strong winds. When taxiing in a crosswind coming from the front of the aircraft, you want to position your controls like you would be turning into the wind with a neutral elevator. This means you'll have your yoke or stick turned into the wind with no elevator deflection. This will bring the upwind aileron up and the downwind aileron down. When the crosswind is coming from behind the aircraft, you want to position the controls like you're turning away from the wind with down or forward elevator. This means you'll have your yoke or stick turned away from the wind direction with the upwind elevator down and the downwind elevator up. The saying pilots use to remember this is turn into a headwind and dive away from a tailwind. In the real world, this helps prevent strong winds from lifting up the wing or tail during taxi, though you'll probably be fine in flight sim if you don't use that procedure. You also don't need to use this technique in heavier aircraft such as turboprops and jets. So before we begin the setup for the actual flight, for the demo flights, there is one control setting that we want to make sure is where we want it for crosswind landings. So we'll go to options, and this is actually going to be under the assistance options. And it is going to be under piloting, and it is the top one, the takeoff auto rudder. What this does, if it's turned on, is it couples your rudder and your aileron. So if you're making aileron control inputs, you're also making rudder control inputs in the same direction. So if you turn this off, it will decouple that. I think it also does a little bit of AI assisted rudder control on the takeoff roll to keep you on the center line, so that won't be there anyway. But this is where you want it if you're doing crosswind operations, because obviously you don't want those aileron and rudder controls coupled for that. I do normally turn this on if I'm not doing crosswind work or don't have a significant crosswind, so I think it is a good thing to have on if you're not doing crosswinds, but for crosswind work you do want it off. As far as the setup for the demo flights for the crosswind takeoff and landings go, we will be using the Cessna 152. As far as weight and balance goes, I do like to use the full tanks of gas and 170-pound passengers in each seat. That will put you within 100 pounds of max gross weight. That's a good weight to be at for doing crosswind work. As far as the airport that I'm going to use for the demonstration flights, it will be Pine Bluff Airport once again, KPBF. I'll use runway 18, and you can start on the runway unless you're just wanting to practice some crosswind taxi stuff. And as far as the date and the time, we'll go ahead and pick our mid-June day for the lighting at about noon. Remember that you actually need to set your time on the bottom left-hand corner when you're not in flight conditions, and then we'll actually set up the weather once we are in the flight. Okay, so as far as setting up the weather, we do need to do this in flight. It kind of ignores the weather settings in the flight setup. So we'll go up to the quick access menu up here and go to the weather tab. And in order to set the wind, we can see this little wind icon down here. And you can actually add layers here if you want to add multiple wind layers that go up in altitude, so you can have the wind velocity increase as you climb. You can do that. It defaults a ground level wind setting. I don't know how high that goes. I assume it probably goes up, as high as probably 50,000 feet or whatever if you just set the one setting. But if you click on this, it will bring up the wind menu, and it will give you the wind readout. Right now it's variable in direction to 2 knots, gusting to 2 knots. So we can go in and we can change the direction using this little arrow key here, or we can also type in the direction, which is a little more precise. So I'm going to do that. I want the wind out of 270, and the wind direction is which way the direction is blowing from. So in this case, it's blowing from the west to the east, so it's going to be coming from the right as we're sitting on runway 18. I'm going to go ahead and put in 12 knots of crosswind. So here's the wind speed field down here. So I'll enter 12 knots in there. You can also adjust that with a slider, but it's going to be less precise again. And then it will automatically adjust the gusts when you put in your base wind velocity. It doesn't do a very reasonable job. Right now it's saying 12 gusting 72. That's a little heavy, so we'll go in and we will change that. I'm going to eliminate it to where it has no gusts, and all you do to do that is go in and enter a 0. And you can see when you do that, it will delete the gust per minute. That becomes not a factor anymore, and it will set the gust at 0. So now you have just a steady wind, 270 at 12. If you do want gusts in there, you can put in a gust speed manually in here, and then once you do that, you can actually control how many gusts you get in a minute. So you can ratchet that slider up and determine how often you're going to get those gusts. A reasonable gust estimate is usually between 5 and 15 knots above the steady state wind speed. So right now, like we have 270 at 12, so something like 270 at 12 gusting 22 would be fairly typical if you're getting gusty wind conditions. So you can set that in there manually. So that sets us up. That is the maximum demonstrated crosswind component for the 152. So we will do our demonstrations with that, and we are all set up and ready to go flying. For performing a crosswind takeoff in the real world, you want to start the takeoff roll with full aileron deflection into the wind, just as you would in a crosswind taxi. In Flight Simulator, however, this seems to cause more control issues than it solves, so I recommend putting in just a little bit of aileron control into the wind as you start your takeoff roll, and keeping it at about that position until rotation. Just like a normal takeoff, use your rudder control to control your nose's alignment with the runway. In Flight Sim, the aircraft will tend to weather vane into the wind in a crosswind more than it does in real life, so try to use small corrections to keep it on the center line. At rotation, you want the downwind main gear to come off the runway right after the nose wheel and before the upwind gear, going into a slight bank as you lift off. After you lift off, establish a crab angle into the wind to stay over the runway center line and the extended center line once you're beyond the end of the runway. Pitch for your climb speed just like you would on a normal takeoff, and clean up and run your after takeoff checklist as normal. Now let's look at a demonstration of a crosswind takeoff. All right, so I'm on the runway 18 in Pine Bluff, and the wind is coming from the west. I've got my before takeoff checklist complete, and the brakes are released. You notice I have just a little bit of aileron correction in there into the wind. So we're ready for takeoff. I'll go ahead and bring in full takeoff power, and I'm just going to use the rudder control to keep the nose on the center line. And it's going to be a little squirrelier than it is during a normal takeoff or with that takeoff auto rudder not engaged. As we approach rotation speed, we'll just rotate normally, except we're going to rotate in a slight bank. So I bring the left gear off first and then the right gear off in this particular situation. The nose wheel, of course, comes off first. Then I just pitch for my 70 knots and clean up. And once I get airborne, I do want to release those cross controls and then establish just a little bit of a crab angle to keep myself aligned over the center line of the runway and over the extended center line as I get past the runway. Then you just clean up and do your after takeoff checklist as normal, and that is a crosswind takeoff. As you fly the pattern, be aware of the wind's effect on your ground track. A wind coming from the right of the aircraft, as viewed when you're sitting on the runway or on final, will affect the pattern differently than a wind coming from the left, as viewed when you're sitting on the runway or on final. If you have a wind coming from the right, be aware that on crosswind, you're going to have a high ground speed due to that leg having a tailwind. This is going to cause a tendency for you to overshoot or fly a wide downwind turn and fly a wider than normal downwind. Make sure if you're flying at a familiar airport that you use your familiar ground references to fly a normal pattern. On downwind, make sure that you establish a crab angle to correct for wind drift, and again, maintain your ground track by ground reference. If you're in a familiar pattern, make sure that you're flying over your familiar landmarks. If you're in an unfamiliar pattern, make sure that you're referencing the runway as you fly the pattern to keep an appropriate distance from the runway. On base, be aware that you're going to have a slow ground speed because of the headwind that you'll have on this leg. and that this will cause a tendency to undershoot the final. To compensate for this, you can delay the turn to final or use a small bank angle, a smaller turn as you turn to final. So when you have a wind coming from the left, as viewed as you're sitting on the runway or on final, be aware that on crosswind, you're going to have a slow ground speed because you have a headwind on that leg. And this is going to cause a tendency to undershoot the final, or excuse me, undershoot the downwind or fly too close of a downwind. So to counteract this tendency, you want to delay your turn to downwind or use a smaller bank angle to make that downwind turn. And again, try to use those familiar landmarks if you're at a familiar pattern, or take a look at the runway and make sure you're at an adequate distance. Also be aware that you need to roll out a little earlier than normal on this turn to downwind because you want to roll out into a crab to the right into the wind to keep your ground track on downwind. So on downwind again, keep that crab angle in there, and then maintain your ground track by ground reference again, referencing familiar landmarks and referencing your distance from the runway. On base, and this is particularly critical here, be aware that you're going to have a fast ground speed because you're going to have a tailwind on this leg, and this is going to cause a tendency to overshoot the final or fly past the final. To counteract this tendency, make sure to turn final early or use a larger bank angle, but be careful. Don't exceed a bank angle of 30 degrees or use excess rudder to try to correct. This is something we see a lot in the United States, and it's one of the most common causes of fatal accidents in the United States, is pilots will overshoot the final, and they will either bank excessively or use too much rudder to try to get themselves back aligned with the runway, or to line up with the runway in the turn. They'll lose focus on their airspeed, and their airspeed will get too slow, and they'll stall the airplane, and then because they're uncoordinated, that will result in a spin, and those accidents are almost always fatal. So if you do see that you're overshooting the final, just go ahead and correct back to final once you've got the runway in sight. Don't use an excess bank to do it. And just remember, if it gets super ugly, you always have the option of going around. Okay, so I've got it in a flight freeze on the downwind leg, and we'll take a look at the wind's effect on the pattern. And so I've got it in an active pause right now on the downwind leg, and normally I fly my downwind leg just a little bit outside this road right here, and I kind of, as a ground reference, I use this lake up here, try to center my nose on that, and then center my nose kind of on this bend of the river here, and I know that I'm flying the right distance from the runway when I do that. Normally, in a no-wind condition, I'm going to have my nose pointed to the north. Unfortunately, the gyro is drifting a little bit because of the active pause here. But normally I fly just due north, and I don't need to put in any sort of wind correction angle, and I'll stay on that ground track. But you'll see here in just a second, I'm going to do this leg without a crab and show you how the aircraft kind of drifts off to the right because the wind is blowing from the west. It's going to push us off to the right a little bit if we don't have a crab. Okay, so I've got my nose pointed due to the north here, and as you can see, the wind is kind of slowly pushing us off to the right here since we don't have that crab in. Since we're pointed pretty much due north, we're not tracking over the ground. You can see the ground objects are kind of sliding off to the left just a little bit. We're drifting over to the right side of this lake here, and so that's why you want to have that crab in your downwind leg. Now, this downwind leg, I actually have my nose, you'll see it pointed to a little bit to the left of north, or a little bit into the wind, and you can see the track of the aircraft is actually slightly left of where the nose is actually pointed right now. So I am staying centered up with that lake and staying centered up with that bend in the river up there, and that's going to keep me over the ground track that I want to fly on this downwind leg. So on this base leg, the wind is right in my face. I'm going to have a slow ground speed, and it's going to be a wind that's going to want to push me to the left of final, or undershooting the final once I make that base turn. So I want to delay that turn to the base just a little bit, and I want to make it a little bit of a shallower turn. So coming up on the airport off to the left here, and so we'll go ahead and make that turn. And the wind is going to help me kind of push me back onto the final if I do overshoot. So you can see I don't need as much bank as I normally need, and that'll put me nice and lined up for the final here. And you can see as I come in here, if I orient myself directly with the runway, that the wind is going to tend to push me to the left of the runway here. You can see it drifting over to the left just a little bit. Okay, so back on base leg, and I've shifted the wind around to the east, so now it is a tailwind on base. And so it's going to have a tendency to make me overshoot on the turn to final approach. So I want to start the turn just a little bit earlier, and then I may need to tighten up the turn again, tighten up the turn to stay over the runway. As I can see here, there's the approach lights, and so just a little bit of a tighter turn, but just be cognizant not to go beyond about 30 degrees of bank. You can actually, if you undershoot a little bit, you can actually use the wind to help push you back on course, but just remember when you roll out, you're going to need to get that crab in there to stay aligned with the runway. All right, so let's shift the wind back around to the west, and let's take a look at how to do a crosswind landing. Now let's talk about landing in a crosswind. As we've talked about in our navigation lessons, when we're in the air, we use what's called a crab or crab angle or wind correction angle to correct for wind drift and make the airplane travel in the direction we want it to travel. But this doesn't work when you're landing, since having your nose not aligned with the runway center line will cause the airplane to veer in the direction the nose is pointing once the tires are on the ground and friction takes over. So we need to be able to keep the aircraft over the center line, but also have the nose aligned with the runway so we keep going straight once the tires are on the ground. So to land in a crosswind, we need to use some bank into the wind to control the airplane's drift and keep it over the center of the runway, and then use the rudder or yaw control to align the nose with the runway. So for example, if you're landing with a crosswind from the right, you would use a little bit of right bank to keep the airplane over the runway center line and a little bit of left rudder to straighten the nose of the airplane out. If you do it correctly, as you land, you should touch down with the upwind main gear first, then the downwind main gear, then the nose wheel. As you roll out, use your rudder to keep yourself on the center line. No matter how good your technique is in flight sim, the aircraft is likely to be a bit squirrely with the yaw control on the rollout, so just do your best to make small corrections with the rudder to keep it on center line. In the real world, you would want to gradually increase aileron deflection until it is at full deflection into the wind, but just like with our crosswind takeoff in flight sim, it's better if you just hold a little bit of aileron deflection as you roll out. This technique is the preferred technique to use in light aircraft and can be used in aircraft as large as narrow-body jetliners like the Airbus 320. In large heavy jets like the 747-8 that have large engines hanging under the wing, they have to be careful how much they bank when they land lest they scrape an engine, so they do use a different technique. These aircraft can actually touch down in a crab and then use their rudder and nose wheel steering to align the aircraft's nose with the runway on the rollout. But it's generally not a technique that you want to use in light aircraft, as their landing gear are not designed to withstand as much of a side load, though since you're not paying for the strut replacement in Flight Simulator, this technique will generally work if you want to try it out, although it is a little dicey more often than not. You'll also hear a lot of instructors talk about two different crosswind techniques to use in light aircraft, usually referred to as the side slip or wing low method and the crab method. In reality, these methods are the same technique that we've been discussing. The only difference is when you make your aileron and rudder inputs. With the side slip or wing low method, you make those control corrections once you're aligned with the runway and fly the entire final approach like that. This is a good technique for less experienced pilots as it lets you get a good feel for how much bank and rudder correction you need for a given wind condition early on in the approach. With the crab technique, you keep the aircraft in a crab during the entire approach, then dip the wing and kick the rudder in the landing flare. This is the technique that's preferred by most experienced pilots. You can actually enter the control corrections at any point between runway alignment on final and the landing flare. My recommendation is to get your crosswind control corrections in early when you line up with the runway when you're first trying out crosswind landings, and then gradually try to put in the control corrections later in the approach as you gain experience. So before we try an actual crosswind landing, let's try a low approach. This exercise will give us a chance to fly down the runway at a relatively low altitude and get a feel for how the rudder and aileron respond to a crosswind and how much control input we need. To execute this maneuver, fly a normal pattern approach. As you get to about 100 feet above the ground, increase your power to fly level at your approach speed. In the 152, this is probably going to be fairly close to full power. As you fly level down the runway, play around with both the aileron and rudder separately to get a feel for how they respond. Try at least one pass where you try to keep the aircraft over the runway with your ailerons and the nose straight down the runway with your rudder. When you get to about 1,000 feet of runway remaining, execute a go-around. All right, so I've got myself set up on a little bit of a longer final, that's about 500 feet on the glide slope. As you can see right now, I'm coming into making the approach into the runway in a crab. I've got my nose pointed off slightly to the right to correct for the wind drift from that wind that's coming from the west. And what I want to do to actually land the airplane is I want to align my nose with the rudder. So I'm going to kick in a little bit of left rudder right here. And then I'm going to use the bank to align the aircraft with the runway, or keep the aircraft over the runway, the ground track. And then I'm using that left rudder to keep the airplane centered up or lined up with the longitudinal axis of the runway, just to keep that nose pointed straight down the runway. So I've got a little bit of right bank in here to correct for that wind drift, and I've got about half deflection on the rudder right now to the left to keep that nose pointed to the left. And what we're going to do here is we're going to get down to about 100 feet above the runway, and we're going to go ahead and add power and do a low pass. It'll be fairly close to full power. And we're just going to fly 50, 100 feet above the runway, and we're going to play around with controls a little bit and try to keep it right over that center line with the nose pointed straight down the runway. And glide slope's not really a factor right at this point because, we're just doing a low pass. We're not just going to land out of this. So there's about 100 feet, so I'll add that power in there. And then just play around with controls. You can see if I bank to the right a little bit, I go off to the right with the ground track a little bit. And if I bank to the left, it doesn't take much, I start drifting off to the left. And then play around with that nose. If I ease it off to the right, I go back into that crab again. And if I point it off to the left, I can keep that nose pointed straight down the runway. So just to do a couple of these low passes and play around with the rudder and the aileron, and at least on one of the low passes, try to keep yourself centered over the runway using your aileron and keep your nose pointed straight down the runway using your rudder. And then once we get to 1,000 feet of runway remaining, the big captain's bars there, we'll go ahead and add the power, pull in the flaps, and execute a go-around. Okay, so I'm out here on another long final here, about 800 feet MSL. And again, I'm using the crab right now to keep aligned with the runway, but this time we're going to take it all the way to a landing. So once I've got myself lined up with that center line, I'll go ahead and use that wing low method here. So I'm going to go ahead and kick the rudder in to get myself centered up with the runway. You'll notice you may need to add a little bit of power when you do this because you are putting yourself in a bit of a slip, which is going to increase your drag, so you may need to increase the power. And so I've got my rudder off to the left here to keep it lined up with the runway, and I've got my wing dipped to the right to keep myself over the runway center line. And I'm going to do this all the way to the ground. I'm going to bring the power off just a little slower than I would in a normal landing and bring it down just a little slower. I'm not going to just chop the power as I get over the threshold like I do with a normal landing. And so you can see I'm keeping myself pretty well right centered up with the runway, again using the rudder to keep my nose pointed straight down the runway, and I've got a little bit of that right bank in there to keep my wind drift from pushing me off to the left. Once you get on the ground, you want to keep just a little bit of that control deflection to the right in there, and then it will be a little squirrely on the rudders. It's pretty much, unless you have a super awesome set of rudder pedals, it's going to be squirrely on the rudders, so just use small corrections to try to keep it on the center line. And as I come over the threshold here, I'll slowly start pulling the power back, and then I continually making corrections with the ailerons to keep it over the center of the runway and the rudder to keep it aligned. I do a normal flare while continuing to make corrections, and again I should touch down on the upwind wing or the upwind wheel first, and then the downwind wheel, and then the nose wheel. And then it's going to be a little squirrely when it touches down in flight sim, but just try to make those small rudder corrections to keep it on the center line. It's going to bounce back and forth like that a little bit, and then start to apply your brakes. And so that's the wing low method of doing the crosswind landing. Let's take a look at the crab method. All right, so with the quote-unquote crab method, what we're going to do is I've got myself basically lined up on the center line using a crab angle, and the difference is between this method and the low wing method is that I'm just going to keep this crab in there until I get into the landing flare. And at that point, that's when I'm going to put the control corrections in to do a crosswind landing. I'll go ahead and kick the rudder to the left and align the nose with the center line of the runway, and I'll dip the wing a little bit to the right, put in a little bit of right bank to keep it from drifting to the left with the crosswind we have that's coming from the right that would push us that way. So it's basically, again, the same technique. It's just a matter of I'm going to wait and put those control corrections in until I'm in the landing flare. As I come over the runway threshold, I'll gradually reduce the power. I'll bring the nose up, and as I'm bringing the nose up in the flare, I'll go ahead and kick that rudder to the left to keep it lined up on the center line. I'll dip the wing a little bit to the right to keep it from drifting, and then touch down, downwind wheel first, or upwind wheel first, downwind wheel second, bring the nose wheel down, and then apply the brakes. So again, basically the same technique. It's just a matter of we're waiting until the landing flare to put those crosswind controls in. The last topic we'll talk about is operating in gusty winds. Wind gusts are what happens when the wind blows at a steady speed most of the time, but occasionally blows at higher speeds for a brief period. For example, if you have a wind speed indicating 15, gusting 25, it means the wind is blowing at 15 knots most of the time, but occasionally picks up to 25 knots for a brief period. You can see the effects of this in Flight Simulator, as the gust will cause your airspeed indication to bounce around, and this is true to real life. Flying in these conditions is not easy. It's often turbulent and difficult to keep a steady speed on approach. The worst effect is that if a gust dies off suddenly, it can cause a sudden drop in airspeed, bringing you dangerously close to stall speed. To compensate for this, we add gust correction to our approach speed. To get this correction, add half the gust factor to your approach speed. The gust factor is the difference between the steady state wind and the gust. For example, if we have a wind speed of 15 gusting to 25, the gust factor is 10 knots. 25 is the gust, 15 is the speed, so 25 minus 15 is 10 knots. Half of 10 is 5 knots, so we would add 5 knots to our approach speed. So in the 152, we fly our final approach at 60 knots, so we would add 5 knots, and in these type of conditions, we would fly the final approach speed at 65 knots. You just want to be careful. Usually you don't have gusts of more than 10 or 15 knots, but if you do, you want to make sure that if you're applying a gust correction, you're not going above your flap limit speed. So that concludes this lesson. Hopefully this gives you the confidence you need to fly in windy conditions and to tackle crosswind takeoffs and landings. As always, if you're enjoying the content, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.